refuse to cooperate with officers of the Union. That was James Madison's answer for federal overreach. But the government-run schools never teach about the father of the Constitution's strategy to stop the feds, and he was far from alone. The founders did not tell us to wait on government to somehow magically limit itself. They told us to act. So on this episode, I'm going to break down exactly how they expected us to enforce the Constitution, whether the government happens to like it or not. But first of all, welcome, and thank you for joining me here on the path to liberty. My name is Michael Boulder with the 10th Amendment Center, and this is the show for Friday, February 14th, 2025. Now, understanding how to enforce the Constitution, what the founders said is the enforcement mechanism for it, starts with understanding some essential foundational principles. First of all, the fact that government is not a ruler, it is our agent, nothing more. St. George Tucker put it like this: it being one of the great fundamental principles of the American governments, that the people are the sovereign, and those who administer the government, their agents and servants, not their kings and masters. Just with that, it should be obvious who has the final say over anything and everything in the American system. Here's how John Jay, the first Chief Justice, put it: the Constitution only serves to point out that part of the people's business which they think proper by it to refer to the management of the persons therein designated. And one of the most fundamental principles of this system, where the people are the source of all power and government only acts as its agent, is that, well, government has rules, and those rules are in the Constitution, and the Constitution is supreme, not the views of the government about the rules given to the government by the people of the several states. Here's William Davey explaining this. They can do only what's been delegated to them and nothing more. He said it can be supreme only in cases consistent with the powers specially granted and not in usurpations. If you're new to the channel, you may not have ever heard really the use of the term usurpation, but for the founding generation, this was in essence theft of power. If the people hold sovereignty, final authority, they delegate some stuff to an agent to do, then anytime the government does stuff beyond those limits, it's usurping, it's stealing final authority, sovereignty, power from the people of the several states. This is a serious issue, and in fact, it's so important that it's in the Declaration of Independence. A lot of people think that the Declaration of Independence has a list of grievances, and I know that's the common term for it, but really it's called injuries and usurpations in the text, or abuses and usurpations in the text. Here's Alexander Hamilton discussing the Supremacy Clause and actually getting us towards this discussion on the enforcement mechanism from the founders. This is Federalist number 33. He said, "It will not follow from this doctrine that acts of the large society, which are not pursuant to its constitutional powers, but which are invasions of the residuary authorities of the smaller societies, will become supreme law of the land. These will be merely acts of usurpation and will deserve to be treated as such." I mean, to be honest with you, I think that's all you need for the enforcement mechanism right there. How the people decide to treat usurpations is up to them. But in essence, that sums it up. As soon as they go beyond their limits, they're stealing power from you. A usurpation of power is a treason against the sovereignty of the people. That's how St. George Tucker described it. And, well, the people have to treat it that way as well. So that's the first point, is that government is merely our agent, and it only just can do things that are within the bounds of the rules given to it. Now, step two is that people then need to understand the Constitution. If you just learn what the Constitution means from the people who violate the Constitution or support those people who violate the Constitution and have created the largest government in history, which is nowhere close to the original legal meaning of the Constitution from the founders and ratifiers, well, you're learning the wrong thing. So we got to do things on our own. Here's Lysander Spooner. He points out that the Constitution as much presumes that the people understand its own meaning. Because if you have an agent and you give it rules, if you don't understand what those rules are, you shouldn't be surprised when those rules are constantly broken. He said, on the contrary, it presumes that the people are competent to understand both the meaning of the Constitution and the meaning of the courts, and consequently, that they are competent to determine whether the opinions and decisions of the courts correspond with the Constitution. I would add, now he was using that in context of the judiciary, but if the people understand the Constitution, they also understand when the executive or the legislative, any part of government, goes beyond the limits of the Constitution or states and the state constitutions. But here's the key point, because when government usurps power and you treat that as such, like Hamilton said, well, Spooner, this is almost a century later in 1850, points out, well, whether, therefore, their decisions are to be obeyed or resisted. So just a quick point. I'm not going to get into too much detail here on how to understand the original legal meaning of the Constitution. Most people think, well, what did the Supreme Court have to say? Well, the Supreme Court is part of the largest government in history. So maybe some things it says is correct, but maybe it's been wrong on a ton of stuff for a long, long time. And that's part of why the government is so massive when it's not supposed to be. Here's Thomas Jefferson. This is an example of how many of the founders told us the way to understand the original legal meaning of the Constitution, like any legal document, have to understand how the people who gave it legal force understood it. Jefferson wrote, on every question of construction, carry ourselves back to the time when the Constitution was adopted. Recollect the spirit manifested in the debates, and instead of trying what meaning may be squeezed out of the text or invented against it, conform to the probable one in which it was passed. Again, understand how the people who gave it legal force, that is, the people in the state ratifying conventions, how they understood the documents. You have to read the debates and the essays back and forth, Federalist and anti-Federalist alike. There is no one authoritative guide to understand this. James Madison confirmed the same view. He said, I entirely concur in the propriety of resorting to the sense in which the Constitution was accepted and ratified by the nation. In that sense alone, it is the legitimate Constitution. So we start out understanding that government is just merely an agent. And then we also get to the point that, well, government can only do what's been delegated to it in the Constitution. So step 2 is the people have to understand their Constitution. And then we understand that all government officials take an oath to follow it. And when they go beyond that, they have to do something. Here's how St. George Tucker put it. He reminds us that acts that go beyond the Constitution are no law at all. They're a nullity. He said acts of Congress to be binding must be made pursuant to the Constitution. Otherwise, they are not laws, but a mere nullity, or what is worse, acts of usurpation. And what should the response be? Well, Tucker is very clear. First of all, the people are not bound to obey them. But on top of it, everyone who takes an oath of office, they are supposed to support the Constitution, and that means defend it against usurpations of power. He said the several departments and officers of the government, both federal and state, are bound by oath to oppose these acts of usurpation. But not just opposing it by saying, oh, let's take it to court, or let's talk about it, complain about it, petition, wait for another round of elections, whatever it may be. That's not how you oppose a usurpation of power. He said, for being bound by oath to support the Constitution, they must violate that oath whenever they give their sanction by obedience or otherwise to any unconstitutional act of any department of the government. In other words, they're all oath breakers, virtually every single one of them. And I know that seems like a really high standard, but I think we the people, we deserve much better. We need to raise our standards and start treating ourselves better by only holding to a proper standard when it comes to the Constitution. That's a quick side note. So some people will say, well, okay, so what do we got to do then? We just got to make sure these people understand the Constitution, we'll show them the document, and then that's great. But as James Madison and so many other founders, especially on the Federalist side, told us, words on paper don't enforce themselves. They never did. They never will. Relying on that to happen causes people to blame the Constitution for what we're in. Or it causes them to say, well, nothing can be done because, unless we get the right words. So we got to wait to get the right words down and then they'll follow it. James Madison here in Federalist number 48, he thought this was pretty absurd. He said, a mere demarcation on parchment of the constitutional limits of the several departments is not a sufficient guard against those encroachments which lead to a tyrannical concentration of all the powers of government in the same hands. So no matter how good you get these separation of powers down, just putting it on paper is not enough. Roger Sherman, one of the GOATs, he had a very similar take. This was writing as a countryman, his second essay in 1787. All this stuff will be linked to in the show notes, all these original source documents, especially because I'm just scratching the surface here. And you'll definitely want to read more in and learn more in context on your own time. Alan Mosley organizes the blog post for every single episode and has a show links section and all the other platforms. So I'm very grateful for the very consistent and solid work that Alan does. We all love him, of course, especially on Valentine's Day. But I will get that published over at 10thamendmentcenter.com/Path to Liberty a couple of hours after this live stream is done. Here's how Roger Sherman described even a Bill of Rights. He said, no Bill of Rights ever yet bound the supreme power longer than the honeymoon of a new married couple, unless the rulers were interested in preserving the rights. So Sherman's pointing out, you can give them all these rules, and at first, they'll certainly follow them because, everybody loves each other, and it's pretty awesome. But over time, the honeymoon phase fades away, and then they'll only follow those rules if they feel it's in their best interest to. And obviously, just asking them to do that is not, they don't see it as in their best interest, and they haven't for a long, long time. So since you can't rely on words on paper to enforce themselves, and government people always generally tend to increase their power, governments over time always grow and grow and grow. If you want government to be kept in check within the bounds of the Constitution, if you want the Constitution enforced, it's got to be something other than the government itself, and it's got to be something other than a piece of paper, because those things don't do the job. John Dickinson, the penman of the American Revolution, the lead drafter of the Articles of Confederation, and here he is writing in support of the Constitution as Fabius number 4. He said, in response to a bad administration, to violations of the Constitution, it's up to what he said, the supreme sovereignty of the people. That term sovereignty is used a lot by the founding generation because they understood where final authority was supposed to lie. They fought a long, bloody war to escape a system where they could just change the rules whenever they wanted to because the government itself held their own final authority, or they claimed it. So for Dickinson, the answer is before the supreme sovereignty of the people. He said, it is their duty to watch and their right to take care that the Constitution be preserved, or in the Roman phrase, on perilous occasions, to provide that the Republic receive no damage. And I'll tell you what, sitting around and asking government to stop doing the things that government was never supposed to do in the first place and hoping that they will listen to you is not taking care that the Constitution be preserved. It's almost certainly, in most situations, guaranteeing that it's going to continue providing more damage to the Republic. So how does a free people ensure that that Republic received no damage? Well, James Iredell, one of the first Associate Justices of the Supreme Court, put it like this: the only resource against usurpation is the inherent right of the people to prevent its exercise. We'll get to how he expected that to happen in just a few minutes. But it's really important to understand that he wasn't just saying this was just a mere good idea to try later on or as a last resort. It's the only way to deal with usurpation of power. Government needs to know that if it goes beyond its limits, the inherent right of the people, the supreme sovereignty of the people, is going to step up and prevent them from going beyond those limits. A free people can never be too quick to oppose usurpations of power. So that's James Iredell. Thomas Jefferson had a very similar take some years later. Here he is writing in his draft for the Kentucky Resolutions of 1798. Where powers are assumed which have not been delegated, a nullification of the act is the rightful remedy. Now, this is not just some mere good idea or something to think about or a last result. It is last resort. This is the rightful remedy. It's the only way to deal with these people. So, how do you implement these things? How do we implement a nullification as the rightful remedy or the inherent right of the people to prevent its exercise? Well, we get all kinds of advice and different strategies from the founders. Let's start with the father of the Constitution and Federalist number 46, like right at the beginning there. He gave us a 4-step or a 4-point blueprint on how to stop the federal government when it goes beyond the limits of the Constitution, what he called unwarrantable acts. And he actually said you should use this exact same 4-step strategy when they do things that are within the bounds of the Constitution, but just bad policy, what he called warrantable acts. Warrantable, but, unpopular measures. First of all, we have to have massive public protests and disobedience by the people at large. We need vocal opposition from various governors. States are supposed to use legislative devices and primarily use them to implement a refusal to cooperate with officers of the Union. And Madison said in just one state, one large state, this would create a very difficult situation for the federal government. And he said if it were done in several adjoining states, it would create an environment, in his words, that the federal government would hardly be willing to encounter. So that's James Madison, father of the Constitution, telling us how to enforce the Constitution. And none of the steps revolved around something to do with the federal government. All was on a state, local, and individual level. A month earlier, Roger Sherman came to basically the same strategy. He said all acts of the Congress not warranted by the Constitution would be void, starting out with that base principle that any act beyond the limits of the Constitution is a usurpation. Usurpations of power are void, or as St. George Tucker called it, a nullity. He said, nor could they be enforced contrary to the sense of a majority of the states. And from these 2 short sentences, we get 4 essential principles about the enforcement mechanism for the Constitution. First of all, governments do what governments do. It's usually not very awesome. They tend to violate the rules given to them. So even though there is a Constitution, there are going to be acts of Congress that are not warranted by that Constitution. Now, just telling them that they're void doesn't do the job. Words on paper don't enforce themselves, and government will still try to enforce their stuff if they can get away with it. And 3, in a federal system, a union of states like we have under the Constitution, when a bunch of states refuse to go along, refuse to enforce, the feds can't get the job done. The feds cannot enforce contrary to the sense of a majority of the states. But more important than all of that, this requires the people to refuse to obey. Because there's nothing for the states to help the federal government enforce if everyone is just complying. So if you want to defeat federal programs, you have to disobey them. And we hear this over and over and over from the founding generation, over and over. Here's Theophilus Parsons in the Massachusetts Ratifying Convention, an incredibly important person during the ratification debates. He was also the Chief Justice of the Massachusetts Supreme Court as well in the years to follow. Most people never even hear about him today, but he had a lot of important stuff going on during the ratification debates. And here's how he put it. An act of usurpation is not obligatory. It is not law, and any man may be justified in his resistance. And so that brings me back to James Iredell. I mentioned, before he said the inherent right of the people to prevent its exercise is the only resource against usurpation. Madison tells us to refuse to cooperate, using state legislative devices, disobedience by the people. Roger Sherman says, the states are not going to enforce these things. If the federal government tries to do stuff that are beyond the limits of the Constitution and tries to enforce it, if a bunch of states refuse to go along, well, they're not going to be able to pull it off. But that requires the people to disobey, to resist. And that's what Iredell said. The people will resist if the government usurp powers not delegated to it. Now, of course, he can't speak for generations way down the line who lack the backbone to do what they're supposed to do, but they certainly did follow this approach in the early part of the Republic. Some more successfully than others. Are very successful in response to Thomas Jefferson's embargo in his second term against Mr. Madison's War of 1812. Less effective, even though most of the propaganda and the government-run education system don't tell the real story about the response to the hated whiskey tax under George Washington's administration. I'll do an episode covering that in more detail soon, but this was certainly used pretty widespread in the first few decades after ratification, and then it kind of died out over time, unfortunately. But anyways, this is how it's supposed to be done. Here's Lysander Spooner again in his Defense for Fugitive Slaves, 1850, awesome pamphlet. He describes this right of the people to resist usurpation on the part of the government as a strictly constitutional right. I could have a semantics argument with him on that, but I know where he's going. He looks at the resistance as the enforcement mechanism, just like the founders did, because he certainly read what they had to say and he understood the process. He said the exercise of the right is neither rebellion against the Constitution nor revolution. It is a maintenance of the Constitution itself by keeping the government within the Constitution. Spooner understood, Iredell understood, Sherman, Jefferson, Madison, Parsons, and so many others, even Alexander Hamilton, understood that if government goes beyond its limits, if it usurps power and the people refuse to go along with it, well, they may have something on the books, but they're staying within the bounds of the Constitution because they can't they're getting slapped back pretty hard and pretty quickly. And that's the maintenance of the Constitution itself. And anytime I read this quote, for those of you who've been longtime viewers or listeners, you've heard this many times, but we gotta finish this piece here. Spooner said, this resistance is also a defense of the natural rights of the people against robbers and trespassers who attempt to set up their own personal authority and power in opposition to those of the Constitution and people which they were appointed to administer. I know most people who cite Spooner only know one out-of-context quote from No Treason No. 6, the appendix. But man, he really understood the system of the founders. He wrote about it for decades. And you can see so many of the things that he's talking about here, because even Alexander Hamilton in Federalist 33 was referring to usurpations, things that go beyond what are supreme, the supreme law of the land. Anything that goes beyond the Constitution is an invasion of the residuary authorities of the smaller society. It's an invasion. So usurpation is theft. This is robbers and trespassers is how he's calling government. And then he also recognizes that government people are just agents in opposition to those of the Constitution and people which they were appointed to administer. Now, that doesn't mean that even though this is how you're supposed to get it done, that it's just some, silver bullet. It's going to be quick and easy. That is absurd. Anyone telling you that is lying. Even Thomas Jefferson understood this back in 1790. He said, we are not to expect to be translated from despotism to liberty in a feather bed. And we're not going to expect that this time either. And who knows how long it'll take, but we got it. The ball is rolling. We just got to keep pushing and pushing and pushing, no matter how many scare tactics that they use against us. And they will ramp that up pretty aggressively. But Thomas Paine understood in The Rights of Man, I think part 2, 1792-ish, he said, the strength and powers of despotism consist wholly in the fear of resisting it. I think Samuel Adams, the great father of the American Revolution, probably summed it up best, writing as Candidus in the Boston Gazette, 1771, one of my favorite essays from the Revolution. He said, the truth is, all might be free if they valued freedom and defended it as they ought. So we have to understand and value freedom. We have to understand and value the Constitution. We have to have the backbone to defend it, all of it, against all comers. So here's the bottom line. We got 6 main points on from the founding generation, and I'm only touching just barely scratching the surface on all this. First of all, government is just an agent. The people of the several states are in charge. They are. They just have to start acting like it. 2, the people also have to know and understand the Constitution's original legal meaning, so they're no longer fooled by these supporters of the monster state, by politicians, by judges, by anyone in the system. 3, everyone in office, state, federal, local, they all take an oath, and that means to follow their oath. And we need to have better standards. They are supposed to actively oppose every usurpation of power. 4, because they don't do it, we can wave a document at them, but we should understand it. We should try to educate them, but we have to understand that 4, words on paper don't enforce themselves, never did, never will. We shouldn't ever expect it. And so therefore, that brings us to number 5. We can't trust government to limit itself. So the people have to step up and get the job done. So that's number 6. The only real check on power, the real enforcement mechanism of the Constitution, are the people of the several states themselves. Non-compliance, resistance, and other forms of nullification, what Thomas Jefferson called the rightful remedy. This is how we stop government from going beyond the limits of the Constitution, because if the people of the several states don't protect and defend their own Constitution and their own liberty, no one else will. There is absolutely nothing that helps us reach and teach more and more people about these essential foundational principles more than the financial faith and support of our members. If you support the work we're doing, you want to hear more of this message, you want more people to hear more of this message, please consider joining us as a member today. You can join us for as little as $2 a month over at 10thamendmentcenter.com/members. It's all spelled out, 10thamendmentcenter.com/members. If you got a couple of bucks of that dirty government fiat that they keep devaluing, please consider throwing it our way today. We also have annual, 5-year, and lifetime options, or if you prefer to help us out financially without joining as a member, or if you already are one, I'm very grateful. But if you want to kick in a little bit more, you can do so a one-time gift over at 10thamendmentcenter.com/donate. And no pressure on that, but I'd be very grateful for any consideration you can give to putting your financial faith behind our work today. You can also help us spread the word by leaving reviews on Apple Podcasts or any other podcast platform. Have a lot of watch time on YouTube. The closer or beyond 100% of the video that you watch, the more likely the algorithm will show us to more people. Hit the like button, subscribe, get notifications, comments everywhere. All that stuff really helps out a great deal. I'm very grateful for that. I really appreciate you spending some of your time with me today. I hope you enjoyed this episode as much as I enjoyed putting this information together for you. I hope you found it interesting, but more important than anything, I hope it made you think, and I hope you learned something. I also hope you have a great weekend, and I look forward to seeing you next week here on the Path to Liberty.